Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Padres EVT Podcast in Focus. I'm your host, Diego Garcia. Alongside me, my co-host, Willy Warren, and we are recording to you on either the day before or the day where pitchers and catchers are fully reporting. So baseball is back. The Super Bowl has ended. Congrats again to the Seahawks for winning the Super Bowl. I know you're a Seahawks fan, so that
Yeah, big Seahawks fan here. We're all super excited. Awesome. It's been about 10 years, so it's exciting.
I know our fellow writer Nick Lee. He must be very excited about it too. Probably why we haven't heard from him. But the Super Bowl is past, spring training is back, and we got quite a bit to talk about. So non-roster invites were announced early last week, and we're getting live videos from camp thanks to 97.3 The Fan, the Padres organization, and there's quite a bit to go into, but I think one of the most interesting things about any spring training is whoever makes that non-roster invite list, because you can only extend so many invites. Like every party has a limit of how many people can go to the party. So
yeah, there's some really interesting variation of guys that the Padres brought in. They have the repeat in invitees, and Ethan Salas and Francis Pena, but then they also have some really interesting new faces like Tristan McKenzie and Jose Miranda, who are going to be looking to kind of force their way onto an agenda of Craig Stammen and the Padres organization.
Most certainly, that's one of the most fun parts of spring training is there's always at least one guy who was not on the organization the year before, comes in, has an absolutely insane spring, and kind of forces their way on the roster. We saw that with Gavin Sheets last season, and that was a unmitigated success, quite frankly. So you mentioned a couple of these names. Ethan Salas is obviously, they want him there. They want him around the big leaguers. I actually just finished writing up Salas last night for the Padres top prospects list, which by the time this drops, that list will be going out tomorrow. This goes out on the 13th. Keep an eye out on the 14th for that list. Yes, it's real. It's happening again, just like last year. But so you mentioned Francis Pena as one of these names to watch, along with Tristan McKenzie. What can you tell us about these guys going into spring training? What do you see? How do either of them make the roster?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be easy for either. They definitely they're coming off of rougher years, or rougher even for in the case of Tristan McKenzie, it's a couple rough years, and so it's definitely gonna it's definitely gonna start with both. Like can they show consistency? Can they show I think the velocity that they have, just like this spring when we get the data on them. That's gonna be a huge key for both of them, because that's it plays in different ways for both of them as a starter and as a reliever, but it is a really important key to both of their success, and it's something that's really been kind of fluctuating in the last couple of years for both of them. And so I'd love to see Pena return to that 97 range, where his two-seamer can be really, really effective, and Tristan McKenzie, if he can play that four-seamer around 94, even just sitting around 93 would be absolutely huge for his caliber of spin rates and all that sort of thing.
I love the point about Pena and the sinker, because with Pena, the big calling card is the the cutter that comes out of the hand at around 96, 98, was touching 99 at times in 2024. You see there was some Emmanuel Clase in there without the off-field stuff, as far as we know. And that was one of the things that got people really excited about Pena. I know last year I was a little lower on Pena than some other guys because just the cutter as the primary, it's not necessarily an unconventional choice, but you have to be more precise given the movement, especially against left-handed batters. If you try to backdoor that thing, you might end up right in the swing path. And last season, of course, was not what he or the organization was expecting. He was looking like 40-man roster candidate going into the season, and then he has the season he has. And then with McKenzie, the velocity is always going to be a concern because he's never been somebody who throws really hard. He's been 92 to 94 most of the time. I still remember going back to 2020 when he debuted. Bob Costas, I think, who was on the broadcast for MLB Network, it might have been Matt Vescourage, accidentally called him a flamethrower, and I'm watching him pitch. I'm like, wait a minute, that description doesn't quite match what the eye test is seeing and what the score bug says, like, 92, 94 miles an hour. But he has been a serviceable starter in the past, and with this team, Craig Stammen openly admitted that there is a bit of a roster battle for that 4 and that 5 spot in the rotation as of the day of recording. So I think McKenzie has the track record of, he can be a servable starter. I'm going back in here. Just looking at his Savant, but Savant only gives you 3 seasons worth, so that's got to look for that somewhere else. That, he was an effective starter in 2022. So there's definitely a possibility that, he could be a starter. I think he's going to be one of those players to keep an eye out on because of the track record and the connections with Ruben Niebla. But I know you mentioned a couple of other names, Jose Miranda, who could make it, as that lefty hitting. And it's interesting because last spring we had this conversation was being had about something called a Yuli Gurriel.
Yeah, that's it. Obviously, these non-roster invites can be very, very volatile, just to say the least. They could be maybe a veteran who really helps the team and comes in and like brings a positive impact, or you think maybe they're too old for the game now and they should probably move off. That's probably their last major league camp. So that was probably more the case, the latter with Yuli Gurriel. But for Jose Miranda, he's only 1 year removed from a solid season. He was a 760 OPS guy, and there's definitely some questions like as to where that went, and who's going to be now. But there is a kind of there is definitely a spot where the Padres could use someone who hits left-handed pitching, because that was something they really struggled with all of last season, and to bringing him in kind of feels like a really great idea, just to see if he could make the noise that would be necessary for them to consider giving him starts versus left-handed pitching, because right now it's kind of him. You have Campusano, you have Sheets maybe playing against left-handers. That's kind of the crowd, and then obviously they just brought in Miguel Andujar, who figures to occupy that role for the majority of the time. But even he could give starts off to Cronenworth, and it could get really interesting if Miranda were to have that huge spring and really drove up some question marks to Craig Stammen and the Padres coaching staff.
Yeah, it's with Miranda. It's really fascinating because while you were giving us the rundown on what to expect from Miranda, I went in and saw his splits against lefties and righties. He was actually better against right-handers in 2024. His last full sample at the major, so he had something of a reverse split. It's real interesting when looking at Jose Miranda, especially with the addition of Miguel Andujar. But Andujar has had some injuries in the past when he was coming up with the Yankees, and then after his rookie year, he played about 3 games in 2019, and then has kind of just bounced around the league. Now, he's carved out a nice role for himself in the league as, someone who matches lefties, but there is always the concern, in the back of your mind of, okay, is there a possibility that he, has a short-term or even a long-term injury? I think Miranda is going to be a great player to watch this spring. You really hope he doesn't blow his shot. But I'm not just saying that because he's Lin-Manuel's cousin, but with Miranda specifically, I think at the very worst, he is Andujar insurance at AAA. And the Padres have had some good bats spend time in AAA before calling them up. We saw that with Jose Iglesias was in the system in 2023. He never got called up, but then the familiarity with the organization helped him get back on the roster. But it's interesting that for every player like that, where they have some experience in the minor league system and then they come up and produce, like Donovan Solano and David Peralta, there's about 4 Trenton Brookses, or I don't know. That's just I was trying to think of like the most questionable name I could think of, and that's one of them. No disrespect to the player, obviously. It's just the production.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I do think it's really, really good that you do have that Andujar insurance there. I thought that was an awesome term that you used, because Andujar is you do look at his past season, and he had a higher OPS than Fernando Tatis. Like, I mean, there's no question he had an amazing season results wise, but then you kind of get into where he played, the role he played. He was playing in Sutter Health Park, which is extremely hitter friendly. It's super open there. It's it's a Pacific Coast League park, and that definitely gave him a little bit of help at the beginning of the season. And then he gets traded to Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati, which is the second most hitter friendly park in the entire league, according to Statcast's park factor metric, whatever it is. But and so yeah, he's definitely, because his slug really, really jumped, and that was kind of one of those things. It's like, oh, he's been a great bat to ball hitter for a while now. That's kind of been his calling card in the majors so far, but his slug really, really jumped when he in this past season, and that's kind of one of those things that you take a look at his first season in this new park in Sacramento, and then you look at his trade and you're like, okay, like there's some serious risk here in terms of him replicating that type of production, or even a decent chunk of it.
Most definitely. And I think with Andujar, he signed for $4 million, which isn't a huge amount in the grand scheme of things. So if the experiment flops, he could ultimately get DFA'd, because I think he's out of options. So I know before we started recording, you mentioned another bat who could be in line for some time to watch, and that was Romeo Sanabria, who has been in the system for a while. Consulting over my top 30 here. Oh man, because I know with Sanabria, his season at AA last year was just so bizarre. I heard from one of my contacts over in the Texas League that there was a game early on in the season where he reached on an error, and apparently someone in the organization went to the scorekeeper and was like, "Hey, I need you to turn that into a hit." This is part of why the minor leagues are so fascinating. But when it comes to Sanabria, I'm trying to see where I put him on the list. I put Sanabria at number 29 or 28 at the moment, simply because of the limited positional versatility, and don't know how much life really is left in the bat, because he was great in 2024 across 3 levels. Then last year he stays at AA. He has that insane walk-off with the
awesome bat flip.
That bat flip, and everyone's going nuts. It was Great video if you haven't seen it. But then the rest of the season was eh.
Mhm.
So I want to get your take on him, and what can we expect from him in spring training?
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head with the fact that his bat has limited upside to say the least, and he's not much more than a first baseman who's probably got he's a little bit of a hole defensively there, and so it's definitely tough to kind of project him any higher than like you had him like just inside your top 30. And but he does have a really really strong swing. Like he can provide some kind of like pinch hit power. Like that's kind of where I see him right now. And as he's as he played all of last year at at double A, he's kind of nearing that window where like he could become a bench piece. He could start competing for like little spots here and there, but like he's nearing that kind of time where you're no longer a prospect that's kind of looking to crack a starting job one day, and you're more looking to like see where you can help the big league team around the margins more so. And so that's what I'm really like kind of want to see from him is does he hit righties well when he gets his chance? Does he provide slug? And is it is it something that Craig Stammen and the Padres in the next year or two can say, okay, like we could use this here and there, maybe over a guy like Will Wagner or a guy like Luis Campusano, when that kind of conversation comes up.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, like a great point of like evaluating how can he help the major league team, because I know Sanabria is in a bit of a positional logjam in the corners because you have Gavin Sheets, who's probably going to be your everyday first baseman. You have Sungmun Song, who can play all over the infield. You have Will Wagner, who can play first, second, and third. You have Luis Campusano, who might play first a little bit, and Duhar, not to mention, can play first. And then even just on the non-roster invites, Miranda, and then another guy, Marcos Castañon, who can also probably play first. And I know I did a piece on a couple of these guys who are, guys to watch, and I think like Castañon, I would say has a better shot than Sanabria simply because he's seen AAA. He hit pretty well at AAA, even though it was just a 2-week cup of coffee there, I think. And he has options. I know Sanabria also has options because neither of them are on the major league roster, but I think with Castañon, you're getting a more versatile glove because he played third, he played second, and he played first last year. I think it's just an interesting profile because he's not your prototypical power hitter. He's more of a gap to gap kind of guy. And I'm not sure, what do the Padres want rounding out their bench? Because, we've heard about teams always having that secret weapon that comes off the bench. Like the Brewers had Domingo Santana back in like 2018, 2019, like that sort of big hulking presence in the batter's box. But, the position player side of things is really, really going to be interesting. I know you mentioned a couple names. I forgot who they were. Anyone else on this position player list that you think is going to be worth keeping an eye out on?
I didn't have anybody else jotted for this. I do think it's like you said, it's going to be really intriguing to see what that right side of the infield shapes and bench that comes along with that is going to look like, because we just got word on Sung Mun Song. He's looking he's looking ahead of schedule on his recovery from his oblique injury, and so I mean it's going to be. I think that's where the majority of the eyeballs should be focused, because I think they only had 4 non-roster invites from in the outfield group compared to like maybe 9 from the infield group. So it's like it is extremely packed there, and that's where I see the majority of the competition will be concentrated to throughout the majority of the spring.
Yeah, most definitely. There's obviously the games that get broadcasted, and then plus whatever happens on the backfield. That's not really as readily available. But a lot of big stuff happens back there that is kind of away from the public eye, but it's still an event that's happening because you only have so many in-game innings, so you have to find a way to get them out there. And speaking of in-game innings, the pitching staff had, if I did the math correctly, there's about 13 non-roster invites. We've already highlighted Tristan McKenzie and Francis Pena. Some of the guys who were not in the organization last year, like Justin Yeager, Sean Boyle, Evan Fitterer, even a guy like Marco Gonzalez are really interesting. But I want to point out two lefties who were in the organization last year. I will start by just mentioning that, Omar Cruz and Victor Lizarraga got selected to be on Team Mexico's player pool, so they're eligible, for later in the WBC. But that's pretty exciting for them. But I wanted to highlight a guy you're really high on and a guy I'm really high on, which are Jagger Haynes and Jackson Wolf. I feel like we mention Jagger Haynes at least once every episode. So if you're keeping score at home, that's 4. You can check that off if you're playing bingo along with us. But what do you think is going to be the biggest thing for Jagger Haynes this spring? What do you think is going to be that storyline with him?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little, like a little bit ago with Sam, is that if he can limit the damage against right-handed pitchers, is that that's or hitting is that's kind of, I think, the biggest key for him is can he string together damage-free innings without that big double or that big home run, because that's those are that's kind of like the biggest knock on him, I think, is his ability to keep the ball in the yard and be effective against right-handed hitting. I don't know why I tried to say pitchers again, but yeah, I'd love to see him develop that third pitch more. I think he's still being pushed as a starter, and I assume he'll get some starts, kind of like we saw with Braden Nett last spring. We saw him get some huge starts in a night game versus the Mariners and a big one against the Dodgers, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them kind of push Haynes on that same on that same path as hey, take this start and see what you can run with it. And I would love to see him really improve his contact suppression against right-handers in that kind of those opportunities he gets.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I can see him starting like the first game of spring, because normally that first game is always, they give the start to a guy who they're clearly, there's some belief in him, but at the same time he's not either not on the 40 man or they just want to give him a look before they get some of the other guys fully up to speed. I think with Haynes, you're definitely right. I think we're definitely gonna have to see how he fares against right-handed hitters. Last year, righties hit over 300 against him, but he's still figuring out the full extent of his pitching, because he was drafted in 2020, but he missed like 2 full seasons. He didn't debut until 23, so technically this is his 3rd or 2nd full season workload that he's coming off of. So I definitely think we'll have to keep an eye out on him this spring. This won't be the last that we speak of him on this podcast, be sure. And then I want to talk about Jackson Wolf a little bit, because not only one of the most intriguing player histories in terms of how he got to the team. They drafted him in 2021, I believe in the 8th round, comes up for 1 start in 2023.
In Detroit, yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting. I remember watching that start and I was like, okay, there's something here. His delivery is just so funky. He's a huge human being. He's, I believe, 6'7", if I'm not mistaken. And he comes at you from a really low vertical approach angle. It's like everything's kind of moving upward a little bit. Then he gets traded. Then he gets DFA'd by the Pirates. The Padres trade bet to get him back, and his 2024 is a nightmare. Last year, they give him a month in AA, build his confidence, goes up to AAA, and he actually does fairly well for AAA standards. I believe he, if I remember correctly, I gave him the AAA Pitcher of the Year award because, to hold your own in that setting is really, the way that he did was really impressive. He had a no-hitter going, I believe, at Sutter Health Park for about 7 innings in his longest outing of the year. And with Wolf, I read about him because he's such an intriguing arm because he's huge. He gets big extension off the mound, and yet everything looks like it's coming up at you. He doesn't throw very hard, but he knows where he wants to put it. And I think part of the reason why his command was the last couple of years is the PCL. Because especially when you rely a ton on breaking balls, the PCL is, not to be Dr. Seuss and Rhyme, but the PCL is hell for pitchers who, rely a lot on movement. It's like Colorado or worse. So I think with Wolf, I want to see if they're going to have him be a starter or a reliever, because I would rather see Jackson Wolf in the major leagues than Kyle Hart because of the upside. And because with Kyle Hart, we kind of know what he's going to be. Now they did talk about, what his role could be, earlier today, but I'd rather trust the homegrown guy who, has upside, even if it's not like the highest upside, there's still some upside instead of kind of know what you're getting. I know I kind of went on a ramble for about a minute or two there, but what are your thoughts on Jackson Wolf and, the kind of role he could play?
No, yeah, Wolf, I think it's it's a super weird, kind of profile where his 7.6 feet of extension that he gets that would lead the league. I believe that's about as far down amount as a human being can get. And but then he throws a slider a ton at well under 80 miles an hour, which is extremely tough to locate when you're relying that much on break. Like, it is a huge sweepy, it is a gyro grip, but it's a kind of it gets more like sweep type action, and that's incredibly tough for any pitcher to try to land in the zone in that type of environment up there. So I do think I'd love to see him over Hart as well. I'm absolutely with you on that, and because he gets great tail from his kind of low slot, and I do think it's something I want the Padres to be more aggressive with, because it's definitely it is a weird, but it's a really, really exciting profile that I think could get results at the major league level. And I would love to see him at least get a couple shots to start this spring, and just see how it plays against better hitters, because as you said, you had him as your best pitcher, and for the Padres AAA team, and that's that's not easy. There's tons of hitters coming in and out who are near the MLB level, and so I'd love to see him take it up a little bit of a notch against the better competition that he's going to face this spring.
Yeah, this spring is fascinating so far. Just based on the things that we've heard, we can pivot to that a little bit, because we've gone over quite a few non-roster invites. So we are hearing, I pulled up the kind of the breakdown from Stammen's presser today. So they're talking about Sungmun Song's health. We briefly touched on that he is ahead of schedule in his recovery from the oblique injury. Randy Vasquez has the inside track to the 4th or 5th spot in the rotation. I think some of the things with Randy that we heard are just really interesting, because we are admittedly, we believe in Randy Vasquez on this show. we've kind of sung our praises to him, but apparently this is one of the more fun comments from Craig, that Yu Darvish is trying to teach Randy how to be the quote unquote Dominican Yu Darvish, which just when you hear that sentence, that's it's one of the more it's definitely a spring training sort of sentence. You won't hear that during the year, you'll definitely hear sentences like that in spring training. We're both big pitching guys. We both love diving into how that all works. Uh, basically, I'm trying not to ask, do you think it'll happen? Like if, you will be able to teach him how to be that. But with Randy having such a fleshed out pitch mix, do you think that plays part of it into, how they're trying to shape his approach? Like your thoughts on
Yeah.
just that comment?
Yeah, I haven't like thought of him in that kind of sense, because it's tough to compare anybody to you Darvish, even in just like the sense of a guy who throws a lot of different pitches and pitch variations, because no one kind of does that. Like that's kind of a you thing and a you only thing. But now that you kind of like look into it more, and I do think one thing I've just seen across all of my time getting to know, pitch data and advanced, stuff and all that, is that the one thing that expected results and the one thing that the advanced side of stuff doesn't really account for is how many pitches a guy throws and how that has an effect on hitters. And I do think that's the one missing stat that would, that just kind of tells us that Randy Vasquez is a lot better than a lot of people would think about him. Because I mean, I think he throws already like maybe 7 pitches, 6. I mean, and they're different grips. They're different. Like, I mean, it's a huge variation. And so it's a really interesting comparison. And, it's, now it's so cool that it's not just, like he could be like you, like like he could be that type of guy. Like you is actively teaching him, is like actively kind of trying to push him down that road. And, just knowing how good of a teacher he is and knowing what type of guy he is, like it's an instant, like bump on the, stock market for Randy Vasquez. In my opinion, like that gets me way more pumped up to watch him pitch and, see how he tries to attack hitters, kind of knowing now that that's the scouting report on him. And that's how he's going to try and be effective.
Yeah. So I pulled up Randy's Savant page. I know it's a big lighting change for us here, but he already has 7 pitches that he relies on.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the changeup, the slider, and the curveball account for roughly 22%. It's mostly cutter, 4-seam, sinker. He throws his fastball more than 50% of the time, but there's 3 different like variations on the same pitch, and they all do something different. So I will agree that there isn't really a stat to paint. Like I'd love it if there was something like called sequencing plus, where you can kind of see, how sequencing has an effect on, a hitter's, comfort in the batter's box. And because when Randy was mixing up all of his pitches, he was really effective, and he was getting, those called strikes on some of the relatively weaker offerings. Like his changeup was bizarre because it's kind of floaty, but it also kind of drops at the end. And then we saw that a lot against lefties, where he would just dot the changeup lower arm side corner. And there's definitely the tools here, because I know during his prime, big cutter, 4-seamer up in the zone. And if we look at Randy's like heat maps, like sure, the 4-seamer's right down the middle most of the time, but there's a tendency to want to go up in the zone. Cutter, like that's where you would throw his, outside corner to righties, get him to hit it off the end of the bat. I'm gonna remove the share here, but he has the tools to do it. It's just really a question of really taking the next step in his development, because I mean that's a really, it's such a fun quote, just something like that,
Yeah.
and then to see how it's actually really plausible is okay. There's some weight behind this. There's it's not just said for hyperbole, because we'll hear it's in the game of baseball. There's so much hyperbole thrown around, especially in the scouting and analytics department. You know, we'll see a guy with tendencies and traits and be like, oh, he could be like this guy. Like, I mean, I'll admit I'm guilty of this myself. I was, when writing up Victor Lizarraga, because he has got a really interesting, arm slot. He's coming at you from a 19-degree arm angle, but he's 6'3", so his VA, his release height's about 5 feet. It's a really funky like slot, and he has a big sweeping curveball to go off of that. Like guys like him and guys, some of the guys who don't have the overwhelming velocity is kind of why we should have something like a sequencing plus sort of thing. I know I can't even imagine what the formula would be for that. I mean, I already get confused with the formula for there's one stat I was trying to manually calculate once. It might have been XFIP, and then I just gave up. Like FIP makes sense, but XFIP, reading that gave me a headache. No, and I mean, I respect the people who come up with the formulas. Like, I know you have your own formula for Stuff Plus, and I know for the listeners, he did not pay me to say that. He has his own formula for Stuff Plus, and so if you're on X, I'll make sure to follow him for more on that, because I know he's gonna continue to bring that into spring training and into the regular season. But it's just fascinating how, with all of these tools for evaluation, there are still so many gaps that have yet to be filled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really funny that like just like a guy like Randy Vasquez could go and be a like 3.8 career ERA pitcher, or like over his entire time in the major leagues, and his career expected ERA could be 5. It could be that for his entire career, and like there's just that like gap there of there's just stuff that's not measurable yet. I mean, like you said, that would be sweet if we could measure how a pitch like sequence of like affects hitters. Like, that would be awesome. But for now, I mean, like, it's like that's kind of you just really got to take it start with that type of thing, and trust the eye test, because like when he's on and when he's cooking, like you can really see that like the variation of things that are coming at the hitters is like messing with them, and like you can see it, and you can just tell like oh, this team is not hitting Randy today because he's picking the right time to throw every one of his pitches, and it's just too much. And I think that's one of those really interesting kind of like dimensions to pitching that's kind of undiscovered yet, and I would just love to see where the stats world takes that in the future. But for now, I mean, we'll be content with having Randy Vasquez as the most underrated pitcher according to the stats for the next, hopefully for the next 5 years or so.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Like, if Randy Vasquez can continue to be the most slept on pitcher in baseball and continue putting up ERAs in the mid to high 3s in the 4th spot of our rotation, I think Padres are in a good spot. And I'm not going to use that as evidence to say the Padres won the Soto trade again, but let's be real.
Yeah.
So I know next week, for those of us who are listening, first of all, thank you all for tuning in once again. We're aiming to get the show going, gaining some traction. Thank you all for listening. Next week, we're hopefully going to dive into some more prospect talk and hopefully start previewing a little more spring training. We got into the roster invites. We'll see who's where in a week because a lot can change between now and next week, hopefully for the better. But, the one thing about baseball that is always true is you never know until you know. And so we're looking forward to, continuing bringing you the best Padres coverage. Keep an eye out on the links in the description for eastvillagetimes.com, our personal pages for anything that gets put out there. And with that being said, thank you all so very much for tuning into another episode of In Focus, a production of the Padres EVT Podcast. On behalf of my co-host, Willy Warren, this is Diego Garcia, signing off.